again to Curious Conversations. Really pleased to have Sam Orchard. Sam Orchard is the Assistant Curator of Cartoon and Comics Archive at the Alexander Turnbull Library here in Wellington. He is a comic artist himself and an illustrator with multiple publications, infographics, and other works to his credit. He has also been involved in community and youth development campaigns and practices for over a decade. Welcome, Sam. Great to have you. Really looking forward to your presentation. And the virtual floor is all yours.
Wonderful. Well, let's share screen. Hopefully that's come up all right.
Yes, all good.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's pretty exciting to get to talk about my job. It's a bit of a strange one. The only one that I can find in the country, and there's not very many cartoons and comic archives internationally either. So my role exists out of the National Library, which is the library that is about collecting and making accessible our national heritage and taonga. And the Alexander Turnbull was like a mini library within inside of that, and that's for our special collections. So that's things that don't come through things like legal deposit, but are based on us going out and curating those different formats. So the archive that I kind of work alongside is the Cartoons and Comics Archive. There's also the Manuscripts Archive, music, ephemera, contemporary voices. There's a whole bunch of us who are working with those special collections. So just finding my mouse, one moment. So the history of the Cartoon and Comics Archive is a little bit different to most of the format areas that we collect at the Alexander Turnbull. And that's because it's actually come out of a community archive. So in 1991, the New Zealand Cartoon Archive Trust was established, and conversations began around around collecting the cartoon history of New Zealand. In 1992, there was an official partnership between the Cartoon Archive that had been set up and the Alexander Turnbull. And as that partnership moved on, the archive became more absorbed into Alexander Turnbull Library, basically making a case for why we should be collecting cartoons as part of our national heritage. And you'll notice that it was originally called the Cartoon Archive, and that was based around collecting the history of cartoons in newspapers. So those editorial, usually they're just one panel strip, and they're focused on daily or political events. So that was the original impetus for the collection. And for the first 28 years, that's solely what the Cartoon Archive collected. Then in 2019, the Guardians Committee decided, hey, this has been working really well at ATL. We're ready to step down and for it to be taken in a new direction. And part of the new direction was to include comics and graphic novels and webcomics as part of the archive as well. And there was a couple of reasons for why they expanded the scope, partly because the nature of newspapers and editorial cartooning has changed dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years, with hardly any regional newspapers still in existence, and a lot of the newspapers that are being printed now have been consolidated. So there are not as many working editorial cartoonists, as well as the fact that the internet and the comics sector has exploded in the last couple of years as well. So there's more and more people producing comics, graphic novels, and webcomics, and less people producing editorial cartoons. So it seemed like a natural thing to expand it open. And that's when my role was created. And I was put within the Contemporary Voices and Archives team. So part of what I'm doing is looking at the gaps within our collection and having a real focus on diversity. So yeah, the kind of meat and potatoes of our collection are those editorial cartoons that have been printed in newspapers, and we've got things going back from the 1800s to ones that were produced last week, for example, and it can be anything from the original artwork to the original digital files as well. So we've got quite a range, and we can track the development of editorial cartoons over time, but also they provide really, really interesting source material for people who are looking at historical events, because not only do they show what were important events that were happening in the time that were presented in newspapers, but they give those visual clues around what the thoughts were, what the feelings socially were about different issues, as well as things like fashion and architecture and design as well. So they really provide so much more than what you first look at, where you're like, oh, they're funny little drawings, but actually they can provide a real interesting insight into the life and times in which they were created. We also collect strip comics. We have a large collection of Foot Rot Flats, which is probably New Zealand's most famous strip comic. And Murray Ball's other work. We also have things from cartoons and illustrations from within publications like Broadsheet. One of the most famous cartoon strips in the world is Kim Casale, who did the Love Is comics, and not many people know that she is from New Zealand, which is kind of exciting. She's someone who mostly was published out of San Francisco and LA, but came from Nelson. So we're kind of trying to find those links with illustrators and cartoonists and comic artists all around the world, and make sure that we're having things in our collection as well. Part of my role now as well is to look back at some of those really old cartoons and comics that were produced that got banned in the 1930s and 40s, that were seen as kind of corrupting the youth. So a lot of these have been lost, but there's things like Crash Carson by Eric Resitar, who basically just copied his favorite superhero comics from the States and drew his own stuff. Crash Carson was produced when he was about 15 years old. We also have Captain Sunshine, which is one of New Zealand's first kind of superhero comics, which was actually made because the company who commissioned it had produced a watch, and they wanted the comic to go alongside that to kind of promote their watch. The comic was wildly popular, the watch was not. So the company folded by the time that issue 2 came about, which is a little bit sad. But apparently there's original artwork for the second issue of Captain Sunshine floating around there. So these are things that I have on my radar trying to collect. I'm also looking at what are the new emerging trends in comics and cartoons that are happening. We have really interesting stuff being produced online. So having that really scrolling form of comic that you see on the side there, that long form going up and down, it's built digitally and is built for being read on a screen. Then there's other things like Sonic Comic, which comes with a record, an LP. There's people who are making old form kind of zines and self-published comics, including like Battle Comics down in Dunedin. And there's people who are using comics and comic styles like Tara Black, who is recording local Wellington writers events using a comic style. So all of these sort of things are things that I'm thinking about. How do they fit within comics? Are they within our remit? Do we want to capture them and make sure that they're collected as part of our history? And I get kind of presented with these curly questions of where does a comic end and where does a comic start? So people who are producing things just for Facebook, do they count as comics? Someone like Toby Morris, who is making comics for the spin-off, but they're using animation as part of that. They're technically not what you would traditionally see as comics, but people who are kind of expanding it outwards. And then there's games like Overgrown that Leia Rose has done, which is using comic styles, but you get choices about which panel you read next. And that's partially a game, partially a comic. And it's all digital and online. So these are the kind of exciting emerging trends that I'm getting to think about and collect. So I wanted to go through a couple of highlights from the collection of things that I'm excited about and just like showing people. And then I thought I would present some kind of mysteries and things that we want to find out more information about, and in order to collect more, but also in order to enhance our records. So a lot of the work that we do is collecting, but the other half is showing off the amazing work that we do already have in our collections. So someone like Avis Ackers is a really interesting person because the beginning of locally produced comics for children in Aotearoa can be traced back to the 1920s, when the children's pages became part of New Zealand's newspapers in a regular way. So comic books were kind of not quite being printed, but newspaper strips were really dominating the paper, and you can access these on Papers Past. So Avis Ackers was among the early New Zealand cartoonists. So too was Rita Angus, who was producing under her previous name. So Avis was a New Zealand children's writer and illustrator. She was particularly known for these Hutu and Kawa series, as well as The Adventures of Twink and Wink. And we have these beautiful hand-drawn panels in our collection that I've kind of taken some photos of, but she drew each particular cell on a different piece of paper, and you can see, if you zoom up close on them, where she's kind of twinked out bits and her pencil markings on the paper. So yeah, she was born in Wellington and went to St. Cuth's in Auckland. Her strip Star Babies was published in the 1920s. She also worked as a teacher and a children's furniture decorator, and wrote a series of articles for Forest and Bird. And you can really see that her love of nature comes through within her comics and cartoons as well, because she has that real dedication and excitement around New Zealand flora and fauna. I just find them very beautiful and lovely. So I mentioned Toby before, but this is one of the comics that maybe you've seen. It was one of the first collaborations between Toby Morris and Susie Wiles, and Jacinda Ardern used it in one of her first press conferences when COVID was just starting to emerge in the international arena, and we hadn't got it here yet, but we were starting those measures of locking down the borders. And I remember the Prime Minister kind of holding this up and saying, this is why we're doing it, and this is the purpose of what we're trying to do. And I just thought that was an amazing moment to show how powerful cartoons and comics can be for just getting our information in a really easy and accessible way, and to get an idea across that lots of people can understand. So Toby and Susie ended up producing heaps and heaps of different cartoons and little graphics that over the years, this is a collection of 9 of them, but they were using them as kind of visual explainers to talk about the science of vaccines and contact tracing and genome sequencing and variants and transmission and all those things that over COVID was just a bit overwhelming and hard to understand, but suddenly they were being made accessible using cartoon styles and animation together in order to get some of these really complex ideas across. So this is just my little plug about why cartoons and comics are really important and exciting. So we also have a lot of things in our collection that are mysteries. And I use this as a really good example. So this is a Ronald Kennedy cartoon he produced for the Waikato Times in the 60s through the 80s. And we've collected about 1,000 of his cartoons that he had done over the years. The problem is that when you are doing editorial cartoons, they make real sense in the day, but if you don't have the newspaper or the context for what is happening, they become really hard to understand when they're out of sync or out of the newspaper. So I remember coming across this cartoon and just being like, wow, what is this about? And through a lot of research and trying to look through the newspapers that he was publishing at the time, I was kind of taking photos of the cartoons within the newspapers, and came across that this particular one was published during the week that a meat workers' strike was cancelled, hence the pig being like, phew. Oh, not the meat workers' strike was going ahead, so the pig was saved. So this was a way of kind of being like, okay, it's really important for us to make sure our records are up to date, and as they come in, to make sure that social and political context isn't lost, because a lot of the times they're based on in-jokes or things that are very niche to particular areas or a particular time set. So it's really important for us to keep our records as up-to-date as possible, because otherwise our jobs become a lot harder. Another exciting cartoon mystery or kind of researcher request that we had was I was approached by an Irish researcher about this particular cartoon that is called Dublin Culture, and the artist is called Alan Reeve, and it was published in the Irish Times in 1940 and is now up at the Palace Bar in Fleet Street in Ireland. And it shows a whole lot of contemporary writers and artists and painters and critics. And the researcher said, hey, we don't know anything about the artist. It's quite a famous picture in this pub, and people just love it because it shows off the Dublin culture at the time. But can you tell me anything else? Because the National Library comes up as saying that you've got his archives. So I got to pull out his sketchbooks, and he's made these beautiful scrapbooks of his entire life, detailing from his birth right through to his death. And it's got a collection of pictures as well as illustrations and things. And so basically he grew up in Lower Hutt in Wellington in 1910, had two sisters, went to college. Somewhere in his 20s, he began caricaturing people. And this middle picture says, in 1932, Alan Reeve asked about 250 of the more important citizens of his hometown to sit for their caricatures. The results were published in a cheeky book called Lions and Lambs. Another book was called Political. The first exhibition in November 1933 says, this exhibition was widely publicised in New Zealand because the daughter of a former Prime Minister tore her caricature down, then tore it up before a notable assembly, which included the then Prime Minister, the Chief Justice, and other less indignant sisters. Appropriately, a Justice of the Peace bought the reassembled pieces of the drawing and framed them. Which I thought was just a wild story for your first exhibition, for someone to be so outraged by their likeness or lack of likeness to tear it off the wall. But this man ended up living quite a fascinating life. He travelled all around the world, from Europe, Africa, America during the war period, and seemed to kind of live his life by charming people and drawing their caricatures. And that's how he kind of got around. He ended up in LA when Pearl Harbor happened and got stuck there. So he wasn't able to travel, and he didn't have a working visa. And his entries of that time are quite fascinating, because he ends up staying with some Hollywood stars and then writing a list of people who he's caricatured or had parties at their houses. And the list includes people like Alfred Hitchcock and things. It's just quite an incredible story. So I'm really grateful for when we get people writing in with these questions, because I get to go and have a look through our collections and see the magic that is in there. It's quite incredible. So I thought that I'd end with some unsolved mysteries from the collection, in the hopes that maybe someone in the audience would have some sort of memory of these things, or further information to go on. But these are some of the things that I'm working on at the moment. So I mentioned Avis Ackers as one of the people who started drawing those children's cartoons in the 1920s. But there's a whole lot of other people of that time that we know nothing about, including this person called Dee Price. So their comics started appearing in Auckland Star's children's pages in around 1926. And Price then went on to produce comics through the 20s and 30s, including Kiwi's Adventures and the Adventures of a Creek Goblin. And despite the fact that they were quite well-known pieces, we know very little about who Dee Price is. We don't know what gender they are. We don't know anything other than their name, or don't even know their first name, in fact. So a lot of the people who were producing these comics at the time were mostly young women, and so they might have married and changed their name, like Rita Angus, or perhaps pursued careers as commercial artists and then using pseudonyms for their comics works. So there's other people's names like T.A. Chaplin, Jocelyn Harrison Smith, J.E. Graves, someone who just signs their name Ken, Nellie Donovan, Margaret Wigley. These are all people that we know nothing about other than their names, and that we've found their cartoons in newspapers. So my predecessor, who was a researcher librarian, has written an article about early comics and who are they, which I can send as a link after this talk as well, if you want to read up more and find out more about these artists. One of my favorite ones is, I like to look through the collection. There's lots of very interesting pictures of Muldoon, and I came across this, which was part of the ephemera collection, because it's a giant poster, and it's from the New Zealand Unemployed Workers Group. And obviously they were kind of getting ready for the election, and the cartoonist has signed their name. From what I can look on the side there, it looks like a Tim, and I assume that they didn't want to be associated, to be known, so they've just said Tim rather than their first and last name. And I've asked every Tim cartoonist I can think of who kind of drew in that style, and no one's admitted to it. But it's quite a good cartoon, and the person uses Letraset in the background, so I'm assuming that they were a working cartoonist. It's just that no one has admitted to doing it. So that's my other one that I like to show around, in the hope that someone might recognize the style or kind of own up one day to having done it, because it's quite a great evocative picture of Muldoon. And my current mystery that I'm quite excited about is from the Junior Digest. There's a comic called World Patrol, The Adventures of Mark Steele and Dawn Randall. And it's a serial comic that ran out of that magazine from about 1938 to 1950. And we don't know who created the comic. They've always just been referred to as the artist by the editor in question. And it's perhaps the first New Zealand science fiction comic that has been printed. So I've been going back through all of the old issues looking for clues. And on the back cover of Volume 1, Number 4, there's messages from behind the scenes, and 3 people have signed it, so I've been trying to work out their signatures. So there's a Janet something, and a Carl A. Lai, and an L. Wilders, from what I can see. And I've put in some examples of L. Wilding's work and Carl's work. And Carl is someone who signed his work prolifically. He's very, very good at signing his work, and L. Wilding does sometimes, but not always. I haven't found anything signed by Janet. So I've been kind of looking through, trying to find signatures, and I thought that I had spotted a signature down in the bottom corner of one of the comics. It might be a blip, but I was like, oh, it looks like a J and a P or something, but I'm not sure. And it's the only comic that even has the whiff of a signature in it. Nothing else has been signed. So I've kind of gone back and looked for other information. It's quite interesting. The cartoon and comic changes shape over time. At one point, someone writes in to say that they don't find the comic funny, so it shouldn't be in existence because comics should only be funny. And a whole bunch of people write back and say, no, we like it. It's an adventure. And sometimes it's written just as prose, and sometimes it's written as a comic. By the time you get to kind of volume 5, it starts experimenting with panels and captions in this quite interesting way. And then somewhere around volume 10, which is where we're up into 1949, then it changes just to be prose, written word with a few spot illustrations. And then suddenly it stops completely in December of 1950, volume 11, and there's a note from the editor saying that they will work with the artist to bring a new and exciting story in the future. But from then on, there's no more. There's no more comics by anyone of this nature in the Junior Digest. So I've kind of been grappling with what that means and who the artist might be. And I've just got some more information over the last coming days from some people who I was talking to, where some people have done some research into the people who produced it. So the publisher was this Dunford character who ran Dunford Studios. Someone else found that there was a Miss J.L. Rive, which kind of matches what the signature could say, who worked for Dunford Studios. And she's someone who was producing in that area, obviously from a young age. From 14, she was being published in the newspaper quite a lot for her pictures. So I'm like, oh, this is probably the same person. Whether or not she did the World Patrol, we're not really sure. But yeah, so these are the kind of clues that we have at the moment of who it might be. Interestingly enough, Janet married in 1950, which was the same year that the World Patrol stopped. And she goes on holiday. The artist, World Patrol artist, went on holiday for a couple of weeks in that time. And I'm wondering, oh, maybe that was the time that she went on honeymoon. Does all this mean that she could be the artist? Yes. Does it mean that we can confirm her as the artist? No. But these are the sort of things that we get to do and get to think about. And yeah, I thought that might be interesting. And if anyone read the New Zealand Junior Digest or has memories of those early cartoons or the 1984 election and that poster, I'd love to hear about it. But yeah, that's basically me. If you have any questions or things you want to ask, feel free. I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Sam, that was a great insight into what must be a huge collection. You said 60,000 pieces?
Yes, that's right. We have 60,000 from the early 1800s until now, which is pretty amazing. And there's so many gaps still. So there's a lot more collecting to do, but it is being mindful of, like, we can't collect everything, but I would love to.
Yeah. You talked about the Community Archive Trust in 91, which was obviously a community initiative to do what you're doing now. That would have all been physical copies. Where did they keep them? I mean, what did they have their own library?
Yeah, so a lot of people who are interested in cartoons and comics collect them themselves. There's a lot of avid collectors, and I think that the people who set up the Cartoon Archive Trust really understood and acknowledged the importance of cartoons as historical pieces that really can show a lot of insight into where people are at. So they were mostly collecting for themselves, which is why they had a partnership with Alexander Turnbull Library, because we could offer the archival spaces and housing for that. and be able to keep them in an order that's not just sort of in people's garages or homes where they're subject to maybe getting lost, or if people have to move.
Yeah, deterioration through the
Yeah,
environment.
that's right.
We've got some comments. Fascinating, thank you. Brilliant, thanks. So some really good comments there from some of the participants. Remember, if you have a question for Sam, chuck it in the chat and we'll ask that.
I've got
We'll ask him.
there's a question there from Mick around, do you buy the rights to the cartoons or they contributed voluntary? So it's a real mix. Sometimes we negotiate with them, with the artists, to buy the rights. Sometimes a lot of the time the rights remain with the work of the artists or the publisher. And I always try and do a best practice. If someone does want to use a cartoon from our collection, I try and get in contact with the artist to check for permission, because I think that's just best practice overall anyway. But yeah, it's a real mix.
So do you, it sounds like quite a bit of your job is detective work.
Well, I've focused on the detective work for this talk because I think that that's kind of interesting, and hopefully more talking more about it will encourage people to give me more information as well. So it's a little bit of a fishing expedition is that, but I guess there's a real mix between making the cartoons available, collecting the cartoons, and researching the cartoons. I guess that's the core of what I do.
So you get cartoons from all over the place. Do you find them yourself in auctions and
Yep, yeah,
it's
it's very much a kind of wherever you can look and wherever you can find them. As I said, there's lots of people who, particularly those cartoons from the 40s and 50s that were banned and maybe didn't come through legal deposit, are sitting in people's homes and in people's garages and in people's collections. So they may occasionally pop up on Trade Me, or someone might say, hey, have you thought about donating them to the archive? So it's a little bit of fielding requests. It's a little bit about going out and finding some stuff. It's a little bit about chasing rumors. So with that Captain Sunshine one, last I heard it was in a garage in Melbourne, and someone said, oh no, I think it's in Sydney. So it's just kind of following up leads wherever I can.
Yeah, big places to search. I think there's a lot of garages in Melbourne and Sydney.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I guess it's just getting the word out of what you're looking for.
Yeah. And then you come across things, people will send you a message saying, are you interested in this? And this is cartoons and comics that aren't on my radar. So it's really exciting to get to have both researchers and donors kind of contact you and say, hey, is this of interest?
One of the questions I wrote down was I noticed that a lot the cartoons over the years are just so different. Everyone's style is so different. But are there some trends that you've seen over the time in the way cartoons and comics have changed?
I think artwork wise, there's definitely times where different styles come into fashion and go out of fashion. In the sort of 80s and 90s, there was a real kind of like grittiness and grotesqueness to some of the caricatures. They didn't hold back on making you ugly, which I feel kind of sad for some of the politicians. Whereas before that, there would have been, the style was a little bit more held back. Certainly humor has changed over the years, and what, as people's opinions around social issues, that gets reflected through those cartoonists as well, in terms of what we will or won't joke about. And I think the advent of digital printing has changed things so that color becomes a really important tool for cartoonists to use. I quite admire the work that is just simply in black and white, because of the extra work you have to do to show things. Whereas nowadays you can have a color comic and you can just put a blue suit on someone or a red suit to show that they're from Labour or National, for example.
Well, the two colours of the Muldoon, with the red and the black.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
very good use of limited palette there. We've got a question here from Leith. Do you have any cartoons by the New Zealand cartoonist who infuriated Hitler? Was it
David
Eric
Lowe.
David
Yes,
Lowe?
David Lowe.
Tell us about
We have
David
a
Lowe.
few. We don't have a lot. There's a large collection in London, and there's actually a large collection or a medium-sized collection in Wellington City Archives. But getting to see David Lowe's work in original artwork earlier this year at Wellington City Archives was a real highlight. He's a pretty amazing cartoonist. I think that's what's kind of exciting to me, is that we have a number of very internationally famous cartoonists who just come from little old New Zealand, and they're doing work that is making waves on an international scale. And David Lowe is one of those.
Just seeing another question there. Which is your favourite cartoon in the collection? That's probably a tough question.
Oh yeah, that's too hard a question. I mean, there's ones that I pull out all the time. I really do like the Goodbye Pork Pie poster, but that's mostly because of the mystery behind it. And I find the caricatures of Muldoon just very interesting, because he's been drawn from anything from a kind of stately type nobleman to a very ugly demonic pig person. Like, it's just incredible how much information the artist is able to give across about how they feel about Muldoon in particular, just by virtue of how they draw him, whether they draw him as a kind of upstanding, put together leader, or as someone who's a kind of sniveling, horrible potato thing.
I think that's all the questions we've got. I've got one last question before I just hand it over to Kirsten to wrap up our session. But and you probably get asked this all the time, but are you thinking about AI, artificial intelligence, and how that is going to have an impact in terms of anybody being able to create any cartoon using AI systems?
Yeah, absolutely. So the majority of people who are working cartoonists or comic artists at the moment are producing things digitally. And that's a real concern that they're having at the moment, is if they put their things up online, will that be available for the AI machine to use and grow intelligence from? And then what is our role in collecting that as well? So at the moment, we haven't collected any AI works, but it's part of our role is to stay ahead of the trend and to look for emerging things. We had a big conversation about NFTs, so images that are non-transferable, and whether those are able to be collected, and what can we do with them if they are able to be collected, if we can't make them accessible. So it's a really tricky and emerging area, and basically our role at the moment is to keep reading and keep up to date with them and be responsive to make sure that we're not missing out important trends that are happening, but also making sure that we're not undermining working cartoonists as well. So watch this space is probably the best answer I can give you for that one at the moment. But it's certainly on our radar and things that we're thinking about in terms of the ethics of collecting and making sure that we are collecting things that are historically important.
Absolutely, and I think everybody's saying watch the space with artificial intelligence, particularly around things like IP and copyright, who owns things. So that's going to be a big question that needs to be resolved fairly soon, I think.
Absolutely. Yes.
Sam, thank you. I'm just going to hand over to Kirsten, who's been in the background here. She's been helping me run the session, and she's just going to wrap it up.
Hey, Sam. Thanks so much for that. That was so fascinating. Amazing.
Oh, yay.
I would like your job.
It's a pretty good job. I'm not giving it up anytime soon.
No. It was so interesting that you get to spend all that time being a detective. That's part of what I'd probably like as well. Finding out, what, when, and why a particular cartoon exists. That'd be fantastic to be part of that. The other thing I thought was really interesting that is that the Love Is cartoons were by a Kiwi cartoonist.
That's right.
Yeah, they're really famous cartoons. So that's pretty cool that it was a little old Kiwi. Kim Kasali, is that how you say her
That's
name?
right. Yeah.
And I was just thinking of something else. Oh, the collaboration between Toby and Susie was pretty cool. I remember it well, and I thought at the time it was quite good for people that might have English as second language or children. You know, they kind of could get some of the concepts that were a bit big for, you know, with the words and stuff. So yeah, I remember
Yeah.
those thinking, oh, this is a great idea. So thanks for showing us some of those. But yeah, thanks heaps for spending time with us. Do you get to do many of these kind of talks?
Oh, every now and again, it's exciting for me to when we get a prompt like Curious Conversations, because then I can just kind of go wild. And yeah, I'm hoping that someone who listens to this talk might have some information and might be able to send me a message at the library. But any chance that we get to kind of show off the amazing things in our collection, it's just an honor to get to do that, because it's pretty amazing stuff.
Can people come and see some of these things?
Yes, please. You can search
a little trip.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, you can search through the collections and order things up, and some things you'll be able to order to the Catherine Mansfield reading room, and they'll send you a little email. Otherwise, if it's other things, I'll bring them out into a room and can kind of talk you through it. But yeah, I love having visitors. So send me a message and tell me what you want to see. Have a look through the catalogue.
Great.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. That was brilliant. Really
Wonderful.
appreciate it. Thanks for your time.